They buried the files, they buried the photographs, they buried her. But the truth has a way of leaking through cracks in the walls of history. And when you hear this, you'll understand why they tried to erase Emma Richter from existence. It was winter 1873. Bitter winds scraped through the streets of Dresden like invisible claws. Inside a narrow brick building at the edge of the city, the stench of carbolic acid and candle smoke filled a small medical ward. She was lying there, a girl of just 14, but every doctor who stood over her bed swore they were staring into something that wasn't entirely human. Her skin carried an almost translucent pallor, as though she were carved from cold marble. Marble. Her eyes, God, her eyes, they shifted in color with the weather, blue when the sun was out, black as obsidian in storms. And her voice, soft, deliberate, unnervingly calm, spoke in languages no one had taught her, languages that hadn't been spoken aloud for centuries. One nurse quit on the spot after Emma recited, word for word, a prayer to a Mesopotamian god whose name she shouldn't have known. Others claimed she could tell them their dreams before they'd even had them. The head physician, Dr. Capel, wrote that she could answer questions no child should have understood. Questions about astronomy, about politics, about secret treaties signed in rooms she'd never seen. When they tested her, she laughed, and the lights flickered. The city whispered that she was a fraud, that she was possessed, that she was a miracle. But the men in black coats who arrived one morning didn't call her any of those things. They called her Either Key. And just like that, Emma Richter vanished. No obituary, no grave, no grave. No official record of her death, only one strange entry in a police ledger from February 1873. A subject transferred under seal to institute custody. File closed by order of the Crown. They want you to think she never existed. But here's the thing. Once you pull at the thread of Emma's story, you don't just learn about her. You start to see the entire machinery that's been grinding behind history. The machinery that decides what truths are fed to you, and which are locked away forever. They didn't take her to a hospital. They didn't take her to a school or a convent or any place you could find on a map. Emma Richter was taken underground, literally, to a facility built beneath the sandstone cliffs outside Dresden. A place with no name, only a symbol etched into the iron door, a serpent eating its own tail. For weeks, no one outside those walls saw her again, but fragments of testimony survived. Scraps from letters written by a night watchman smuggled out before he disappeared. He wrote of corridors lit not by lamps but by long tubes that glowed with a pale humming light, decades before such things existed in the public world. He described chambers lined with books whose covers were made of some kind of skin, their words inked in a black that absorbed light rather than reflected it. And then there were the accessions. Instead, men in immaculate coats asked her quiet, patient questions, not about her life, but about things before her life. They asked her to describe cities made of glass, machines that could hear thoughts, oceans that boiled with fire, and she answered with the detail of someone who had been there. It was during one of these sessions that Emma said something that made them freeze, something that was later struck from every surviving transcript. She leaned forward, folded her hands, and told them she remembered the last time they had asked her these questions, not in this life, but in another. The men exchanged looks. One of them left the room immediately, and from that moment on, the watchman wrote, Emma was never left alone, even when she slept. You need to understand what this means. This wasn't just a strange girl with a gift. This was a girl who carried continuity, a memory that stretched beyond the span of one human life. And in certain circles, that kind of continuity is the most valuable thing in the world. Because it means access to knowledge that was never meant to be rebuilt. That's when they started calling her Anna Key. And if you think they were the first to use her, you'd be wrong. Emma Richter had been found before, in other centuries, other forms, other names. She told them of a kingdom without borders, a place where rulers did not sit on thrones, but in hidden chambers far beneath the ground. A council of men and women whose faces she could not see, only the rings on their fingers, each bearing the same serpent sigil that now marked the door of her cell. They did not rule with armies or banners, they ruled with memory. Emma spoke of vaults carved into the bones of the earth, where not gold or jewels were stored, but instructions, records of past empires, blueprints for their rise and their inevitable collapse. Every king, every revolution, every war, rehearsed, repeated, refined across centuries until it became an art form. History, she said, was not a chain of accidents. It was a wheel turning because unseen hands made sure it turned. And every time that wheel completed a full revolution, they found her again. Different body, different name, same mind. Her words made the chamber colder. The men in the coats stopped writing. One asked her, too quickly, betraying his fear, if she remembered the first revolution. She did. It began when cities were not made of stone, but of light. When humans spoke in chords instead of words, when the ground itself could be told to yield food without seed. She said that the council destroyed it, not out of cruelty, but because they feared something worse than death, the moment when men no longer needed them. From that day, their goal had been simple: keep mankind wanting guidance, wanting leadership, wanting permission. The council's greatest weapon was not violence. It was dependency, to make the masses think they were free, while ensuring they could not stand without the hand that had guided them. Emma described how they rewrote history after every collapse, how they buried advanced knowledge and replaced it with superstition, how they crafted institutions not to educate, but to train obedience disguised as education. They didn't just hide the truth, they replaced it with a prettier lie. One of the men in the room could not bear to hear more. He left, his steps hurried, as if he feared the knowledge itself could stain him. And in that instant, I need you to realize something. If Emma Richter's words were true, then every war you've heard of, every age of enlightenment you've celebrated, was not progress. It was the resetting of the wheel. And you were born into a world that was already in its fourth turn. They told you history was a story, neat and linear, with beginnings and endings you could memorize for a test. But Emma said it was never a story. It was a trap, an elaborate machine designed not to move you forward, but to keep you circling the same invisible cage for centuries. A cage so vast and ancient you could be born, live, die, and be buried in it without ever knowing you were inside, because the bars were not made of iron or stone, but of ideas, beliefs, and illusions carefully crafted by the same hands that reset the world again and again. Hands that never appeared in your textbooks, hands that did not belong to kings, presidents, or generals, but to an older order that had been perfecting the art of human control since before the first pyramid cast its shadow over the Nile. Emma leaned closer, her voice now low and unblinking, telling the men in the room, and perhaps telling you, that the greatest deception ever achieved was convincing humanity that it was free while making sure its choices had already been chosen, its rebellions already calculated, its heroes already approved, that the council allowed you to rise only in the direction they had already plotted on a map centuries before you were born, so that your victories were not victories at all, but pre-written performances in a theater whose walls you could not see. She said that if you ever want to break the cycle, you have to recognize the architecture of it, the staged conflicts between nations, the false scarcity of resources, the selective accidents of discovery, the deliberate pace at which technology is released like crumbs from a table, because the moment you believe the official version of events without question, you become part of the mechanism that keeps the wheel turning. One of the men asked her why she was telling them this, why she risked revealing what had been kept hidden for thousands of years, and she smiled, slow, unsettling, before answering, because once a man sees the bars of his cage, he can never unsee them, and a man who knows he is a prisoner is far more dangerous than one who thinks he is free. I need you to remember her words, not as a story but as a warning, because if you're still listening to me now, it means you're not just hearing history, you're standing at the edge of it. Emma's eyes shifted, not to the men around her, but to something far beyond the walls, like she was staring through time itself. And she spoke of a truth so corrosive that even those who claim to seek knowledge rarely survive it intact. She said the council's power was not in the things they hid from you, but in the things they placed in front of you, shaping your reality one seed at a time until your thoughts were no longer your own. They understood that direct rule is fragile. People rebel against chains they can see, so instead they forged chains made of invisible links. Culture, religion, morality, and the illusion of choice. You believe you're choosing your leaders, your careers, your desires, but the menu you're choosing from was written for you long before you were born. She claimed that every generation has been inoculated against truth with a carefully measured dose of half-truth. Too little and people remain asleep, too much and they awaken too soon. The council learned to give humanity enough freedom to feel alive, but never enough to truly be free. They knew the mind is the most secure prison when the prisoner loves the warden. Emma spoke of symbols, ancient ones, that appear everywhere if you learn to see them. Obelisks in capital cities, the all-seeing eye on your currency, numbers hidden in plain sight within public rituals and architecture. These were not ornaments, she said, but markers, reminders from the council to themselves of their dominion over the ages. Once you can read their language, you begin to see that what you thought was random is scripted. You thought was chaos is choreography. One man laughed nervously, as if mocking her words would keep them from infecting his mind. But I could see the fear in his knuckles as he gripped his pen too tightly. Fear not of Emma, but of the possibility she was right. Because if she was, then everything he had built his life upon was a lie so vast that truth itself had become unrecognizable. And this is where you need to decide who you are. If you're still listening, you're not here for comfort. You're here because, deep down, you suspect the ground beneath you is not solid. Emma was not trying to tell them what to think. She was trying to teach them how to see. Emma leaned forward, her voice sharpening into something that cut through the stale air like a blade, and she told them that the council's oldest weapon was not war, not famine, not even fear. It was time. Not the kind measured by clocks and calendars, but time as a sculptor of perception, a tool to erase, rewrite, and reshape the memory of entire civilizations until the past became whatever the council needed it to be. She said that history was never discovered, it was manufactured. Every war you've read about, every revolution, every collapse and rebirth had its story revised, purified, and sealed before it ever reached your mind. Do you really think the victors just write history? No, Emma said the victors are selected before the war begins, and the outcome is decided long before the first shot is fired. The blood spilled on the battlefield is not the price of victory. It is the camouflage that hides the true transaction. Emma told them of ancient libraries burned to ash under suspicious circumstances, of archaeological finds that vanish into private vaults, of maps that show lands you were never meant to know existed. She said the council understands that erasing a people is easy. You erase their history, and soon they no longer know who they were. And a man who does not know his past cannot navigate his future. He becomes clay, waiting to be shaped. One of the younger men interrupted, demanding proof, thinking perhaps he could force her into a corner. Emma didn't argue. She simply asked him what year it was. When he answered, she asked how he knew, and when he said, "Because that's what everyone says it is," she smiled. "That," she said, "is the point. You've been taught to accept time itself as given, never questioning who decided when your year zero would be or why." She warned them, and I warn you now that once you understand the depth of this manipulation, you will start to see how every fact you've been taught is a scaffold built on quicksand. Your calendar, your maps, your history books, they are not records of reality. They are the architecture of your cage. And the council knows most men will never try to break free from a prison they cannot see. Emma's tone shifted then, lower, heavier, like she was dragging something ancient up from the depths, and she spoke of the council's greatest experiment. Not in controlling bodies or rewriting history, but in seizing the realm of the mind itself. They had learned over centuries that fear alone was not enough. Fear wakes men up, but comfort is the poison that puts them back to sleep. She said the council mastered the art of giving people the illusion of safety while quietly draining their will to resist. They built systems of convenience, surrounding you with comforts you didn't know you wanted until they were offered, then made you depend on them like a drug. Every convenience was a hook. Every hook led back to them. Emma described it as a psychological inversion. Instead of forcing chains on your wrists, they convinced you to hold the chains yourself. They gave you screens to keep you informed, but only with the information they chose. They gave you entertainment to relax you, but it dulled your instincts until you could no longer distinguish between the real and the scripted. They gave you words, freedom, democracy, progress, but they twisted the definitions until the same word meant whatever they needed it to mean in that moment. And the most brilliant part, they made you think you were the one in control, that your opinions were yours alone, that your desires were born from your own mind. Emma said that when a man is convinced his cage is the world, you don't need to lock the door. He'll never even try to leave. One of the older men leaned forward, eyes narrowed, and asked her why she was telling them this if the council's control was so absolute. Emma's answer chilled the room. Because once you see it, she said, you can't unsee it. And that vision is the one thing they cannot take back. She told them the council lives in terror, not of armies, not of uprisings, but of a man who wakes up inside their system and decides not to play by its rules. Because one man who sees clearly becomes a beacon, and beacons ignite fires. That's why you're hearing this now. Because maybe you are not like the rest. Maybe you are meant to be the one holding the torch. Emma leaned closer, her shadow stretching across the table like a warning from some other world, and in a voice that seemed to bypass the ears and sink straight into the marrow, she said that if you truly wish to understand how deep the council's power runs, you must stop thinking of them as men sitting in rooms making decisions and start seeing them as architects of perception itself. Entities who have perfected the craft of bending reality until what you believe, what you feel, what you desire, and what you think is possible are not born from your own will at all, but from carefully engineered illusions, woven so tightly into the fabric of your life that you cannot tell where their design ends and where your identity begins. Because they have built a world where the borders of your mind are not walls, but mirrors, reflecting back to you a version of yourself they have chosen for you to see, a version that believes it is free, that believes it chose its own path. All the while walking obediently along the invisible rails they have laid for generations. She spoke of invisible doctrines hidden in your language, in the idioms you use without thought, in the way your calendar dictates the rhythm of your emotions. Holidays designed not for celebration, but for conditioning. Anniversaries chosen to keep old wounds bleeding, just enough to prevent healing. And cycles of a crisis and a resolution that repeat like clockwork to convince you the system is self-correcting, when in truth, it never changes at all. And then Emma told them the part that made even the most skeptical man in that room lean back in silence. She said the council had studied not just history and politics, but the very structure of human consciousness, mapping the thresholds at which men break, the triggers that awaken aggression, the rituals that bind loyalty, and the precise tones of speech that can bypass reason entirely, slipping suggestions into the subconscious where they take root and grow into convictions so strong you would die to defend them, never realizing they were planted there in the first place. She said that if you ever hope to be free, you must first endure the shattering of that mirror, because the version of yourself you've been shown is not you, it is a mask worn for their benefit, and until you tear it off, you will never meet the man you truly are. The man they have spent your entire life trying to keep you from becoming. Emma's voice grew colder, the pauses between her words tightening like a noose, and she said that the greatest deception the council ever engineered was not the rewriting of history, or the control of governments, or even the manipulation of economies. It was the construction of a false self inside. Every man, a carefully assembled identity made from fragments of approval, fear, desire, and inherited lies, stitched together so seamlessly that you mistake it for your soul, and you walk through life defending it, feeding it, protecting it from any truth that might tear it apart, never realizing that this false self is the prison, and every decision you make to preserve it is another lock clicking shut, because they understand that once a man is convinced he is the mask they gave him, he will never attempt to remove it, and in that submission lies their eternal victory. For what could be more secure than a prisoner who guards his own cell and thanks his captors for the privilege of living in it? She said that this is why the council fears awakening more than rebellion, because rebellion can be predicted, infiltrated, redirected, but awakening is chaos, pure and uncontainable, and one awakened man, even if he speaks to no one, begins to warp the air around him, destabilizing the illusions for everyone in his orbit, and the council's power depends on the stability of those illusions like a bridge depends on its supports. Remove one pillar and the whole span trembles. Emma described the awakening as violent, not in action but in perception, a ripping away of every comforting story you've ever told yourself, a realization that your heroes were chosen for you, your enemies were assigned to you, your dreams were planted in your mind like seeds you never agreed to grow, and every victory you've celebrated was measured out in advance, calculated to keep you moving just far enough forward to believe in progress, while ensuring you never leave the maze they built. And then she leaned forward so slowly it was as if the air between her and the listener was thickening, and she whispered that if a man truly sees this, If he allows himself to watch the mask fall away and the raw, unprogrammed self emerge, the council will mark him, not because they can stop him, but because from that moment on he becomes the one thing they cannot predict, the one thing they cannot control, and the one thing they cannot survive if too many others decide to follow. Emma's gaze seemed to pierce straight through the thin membrane of comfort that most men wrap around themselves just to survive the days, and she said that the moment you begin to see the world as it is, not as it was painted for you, you will notice the hidden architecture of control everywhere. The way your history books read like carefully curated myths instead of raw truth. In the way your education never taught you to think but only to remember. In the way your entertainment is saturated with symbols you never consciously decode, but that seep into you all the same. In the way your politicians, regardless of the side they claim, serve the same silent architects. In the way your churches promise salvation while ensuring you never ask the questions that would lead you to your own inner authority. In the way every screen you look at drips with the same subtle conditioning designed not to inform but to frame your perception, so that you never see past the boundaries they've drawn. And once you see those boundaries, once you feel them pressing against you like an invisible wall that's been there your entire life, you will realize the greatest trick they ever pulled was convincing you that this cage was the whole of reality, and every man who dared to think otherwise was dangerous, insane, or already gone. She said the council's true genius was not in building the prison. It was in teaching you to decorate it, to love it, to measure your worth by how well you conform to its shape, and to fear the open field beyond its walls like a wild, godless place where only the doomed wander. And that is why they tolerate those who complain, who march, who protest, because noise is harmless so long as it never dismantles the frame of the world itself, but the silent man who wakes up, who withdraws his consent from their games, who begins to shape his own mind like a blade in the dark, that man terrifies them because he is no longer on their board. And once enough men leave the board, the game itself collapses into dust, and everything they built, every story they told, every law they enforced, becomes meaningless in a single, ungoverned heart. Emma's voice lowered to something almost conspiratorial, the kind of tone that makes you instinctively lean in, and she said that the council fears nothing more than the man who learns to see patterns in the chaos, because once you recognize that the same hands that shaped the wars also wrote the peace treaties, that the same financiers who fund revolutions also fund the regimes those revolutions claim to overthrow, that the same media outlets that terrify you with breaking news also lull you into obedience with distraction, that the same institutions that claim to educate you are the ones that bury the real knowledge in vaults you'll never access, that the same symbols carved into ancient temples echo in corporate logos, government seals, and the architecture of your cities. And that the same cycles of economic boom and collapse are not accidents but rehearsed plays performed over centuries. You begin to understand that history has not been a story of progress, but of refinement, the refinement of control. And when that awareness lodges itself in your mind like a burning coal, you can no longer look at a flag without seeing the machinery behind it. You can no longer watch an election without recognizing the pre-scripted theater. You can no longer kneel in a sacred place without questioning whose hands designed it and what oaths they swore. And you can no longer accept the life you've been handed because you see, with the clarity of a blade slicing through silk, that every moment you comply, every moment you believe without verifying, every moment you mistake repetition for truth. You are helping them build the cage that will hold not just you, but every man who comes after you. Emma's eyes didn't just meet mine. They held me there, like she was trying to weigh my soul against something ancient and dangerous, and in that stillness she said that the final unspoken law of the council, the one that had kept them in power for centuries without the masses ever realizing it, was this: the mind you never claim will be claimed for you. And in that truth, she explained, lies the most devastating mechanism of control ever devised, because it requires no chains, no guards, no armies, only the slow, careful shaping of what you see, what you hear, and what you think you know. Until every belief you hold, every value you defend, every fear that freezes you in place has been seeded by hands you've never seen and faces you'll never know, and you go to your grave believing you were free. never realizing that your life was played out like a script written long before you were born. And she told me that once you truly understand this, you will see that the cage is not built of walls or fences, but of agreements. Silent, unspoken, reflexive agreements you've made without even knowing. The kind you renew every day simply by living as they've taught you to live. And it is only when you begin to tear up those agreements, one by one, that you feel the ground shift beneath you. That you realize the entire world you thought was solid is nothing more than a set of illusions layered over an empty stage. That everything you thought was permanent can vanish the moment you withdraw your belief, and that the most dangerous thing a man can do is to decide, in the quiet of his own mind, that he will no longer be a character in their play. Because when you stop acting the role they've written for you, when you stop feeding their system with your attention, your obedience, and your faith, you step into a place they cannot follow, a place outside their map, outside their reach, outside the very story they've been telling humanity for centuries. And that is when the fear they built into you begins to burn away, and you feel something they never wanted you to feel, the raw, ungoverned pulse of a life that belongs entirely to you.